Hey, all, David Daniel Ducker here, and today I want to talk about fights, brawls, scuffles, skirmishes, battles, action scenes, and this advice can extend to chase scenes, to stealth, sneaking, to escapes, because the advice that I have on how to write any or all of these scenes, the advice I have is treat them like any other scene. There's no change in the literary style or the story structure. How you tell a story should never change. If that story is about a baker making bread, it's the same. If it's about a commando team going in and sabotaging a munitions factory, it's the same. You write it the same way. If it's a romance with the lonely housewife and the mailman, it's the same. You have to just balance your exposition and your emotion. So your action and the reason why we care about the action, pathos. So that's it. You just have to balance those two elements. If you have a lot of pathos, which is typically at the end of the story, if the reader really cares about the main character, then you can really draw out the action longer. If the reader does not care about your main character, you should keep the action short, because otherwise it'll be very tedious because there's no emotion. Bob and Jim are having a sword fight, and they are beating each other up. And Bob is this big hulking guy with a battle axe, and he's beating down Jim. And Jim is this tiny little guy with a rapier, and he's getting the boots put to him. He's getting nicked and cut and slashed, and he's bleeding. Um, if you don't know who these people are, then it's very dull. And you can create pathos by making Jim the underdog, like I just did in describing him. So you might say, oh, he's smaller and weaker and he's getting beat up. So I do start to feel bad for him. And a good author can do that and create pathos in the scene. But that takes time and effort and energy and page count that will bore your reader potentially, especially as you're describing every slash and every parry. Don't do that if you don't have the emotion behind it already, because what prose is really good at is building the emotion over time. It's not good at forcing emotion into a small scene. It's not like a movie where they have music and lighting and the facial expressions are instantly recognizable in a movie. In prose, it takes time to read that. And as you take time to exposit on the pathos, you don't have time to push the action and keep the pacing of the scene hot and heavy like it should be in an action scene. So just follow your basic rules. If you think the audience cares and they're invested, spend more time. That's great. You can afford to, if your pacing of your overall story allows for that to happen. But if the audience doesn't care, they don't know who Bob is and they don't know who Jim is, keep that short and describe it more briefly in broader strokes. You can say, after a long duel, Jim proved victorious with his never say die attitude and his lightning fast reflexes. Just say something like that. You don't have to talk about every thrust and parry and dodge and dive and duck and weave and riposte. You don't need every one of those detailed unless they really care about Jim and or Bob. So if this is your climax and you've had 300 pages to make everyone really care about Jim and Bob, they're going to be hanging on your every word. So you can write more words. So you can describe every parry, every thrust, every riposte. And the audience will be enthralled. And they're like, oh my gosh, I hope Jim doesn't die. He's my favorite character. I've been reading this guy's story for 300 pages. And F that Bob. He's a big bully, and he's been a big bully for 10 chapters. I want him to get the boots put to him, but instead he's putting the boots to Jim. And you have this emotion, and that's what writing is all about, is building the emotion slowly over time. So in the climax, your audience is on the edge of their seat, and they're just dying, and they're turning the pages. They're going to remember this. Their heart rate is elevated. That's what you want. But you can't do it in one scene. You can't do it in 10 pages. You have to build up to it, right? That doesn't mean that everything needs to be boring until the end. It just means you have to pace things so that their attention span is not neglected. So the scenes at the start generally should be shorter anyway, so your pacing's faster that way. So we'll have faster pacing, lots of different types of scenes. We'll have exposition, we'll have action, we'll have intrigue, we'll have romance, we'll have stealth, we'll have whatever we're going to have in fairly quick succession. And then in our middle act, we start to mix it up. Our pacing can fluctuate a little bit, so we can have a little more detail, or maybe a lot if you know how to balance it overall, because now the audience is more invested, right? And so we can have longer scenes, more intense scenes, more involved scenes, especially because they already know what's happening. They understand that Jim's rapier belonged to his grandfather, and they know that Bob's battle axe was carved from the scale of a great red dragon. You tell the audience that early so they understand it later. And then you have less exposition you have to do, and you can focus on the action that's going on in your scene. And that's the same for anything. If you're romance, you're having a sex scene, they're not going to care that these two are having sex in the first act. They don't care. So don't spend 10 pages writing a sex scene in Act 1. But then as you get to know them and their relationship dynamic, and you really care about them having sex, good sex or bad sex, or they hate each other and they have to have sex because they're married, or they love each other but they are kept apart by the villainous Bob or whatever it is. And then finally, at the climax, they get together. And then you can spend longer, not 10 pages, I don't believe, but longer talking about it, because the audience will be involved and they'll care more. So their patience will be greater at that point, right? So really, this video is just about balancing action and exposition and logos and pathos. Logos is the logic of your story. Does it make sense? Have you explained everything so the audience knows that it makes sense? And pathos is why they even care if it makes sense. It's like Star Wars as a film doesn't make a lot of sense, but there's a lot of pathos by the end of Star Wars. And they build their pathos by having music and good acting, good cinematography, and a solid storyline. You have to build your pathos with prose and relatable characters. And we get to delve into the minds and the psychology of the characters more than they can in film. But we don't have actors and lighting. And the way we describe visuals is different. It affects our pacing to describe visuals because it takes time. On screen, they can do that instantly. They can do fast-paced changes of visuals. Like, we can't do that. You're writing a montage visually, you should not probably attempt that in prose. But we can do a montage emotionally, whereas they can't do that so easily in film. They have to rely on, like I said, the music and the actual acting a little more. So the title might be misleading. How do you write an action scene? How do you write a fight scene? The same as any other scene, right? Where is it in your story? How much pathos have we created? How much can we create? How much exposition have we given out? How much exposition can we give out? How does it affect the pacing of the scene? All of those elements. And how does it affect the pacing of the story overall? So I think I'm repeating myself. I'm rambling a little at this point. So I'll call it a day. But in the comments below, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What's your advice? Maybe do a video response. How do you write a fight scene? What have I forgotten to take into consideration? And until I see you again, David Daniel Duckert signing off.